The Battle of Cape Esperance, also known as the Second Battle of Savo Island and, in Japanese sources, as the Sea Battle of Savo Island, took place on 11–12 October 1942 in the Pacific Campaign of World War II between the Imperial Japanese Navy and United States Navy. The naval battle was the second of four major surface engagements during the Guadalcanal campaign and took place at the entrance to the strait between Savo Island and Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Cape Esperance is the northernmost point on Guadalcanal, and a battle took its name from this point. On the night of the 11th of October, Japanese naval forces in the Solomon Islands area, under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, sent a major supply and reinforcement convoy to the forces on Guadalcanal. The convoy consisted of 2 seaplane tenders and 6 destroyers and was commanded by Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima. At the same time, but in a separate operation, 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, were to bombard the Allied airfield on Guadalcanal with the object of destroying Allied aircraft and the airfield's facilities. Shortly before midnight on the 11th of October, a U.S. force of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, intercepted Goto's force as it approached Savo Island, near Guadalcanal. Taking the Japanese by surprise, Scott's warships sank one of Goto's cruisers and one of his destroyers, heavily damaged another cruiser, mortally wounded Goto, and forced the rest of Goto's warships to abandon the bombardment mission and retreat. During the exchange of gunfire, one of Scott's destroyers was sunk and 1 cruiser and another destroyer were heavily damaged. In the meantime, the Japanese supply convoy successfully completed unloading at Guadalcanal and began its return journey without being discovered by Scott's force. Later on the morning of the 12th of October, 4 Japanese destroyers from the supply convoy turned back to assist Goto's retreating, damaged warships. Air attacks by U.S. aircraft from Henderson Field sank 2 of these destroyers later that day. As with the preceding naval engagements around Guadalcanal, the strategic outcome was inconsequential because neither the Japanese nor United States navies secured operational control of the waters around Guadalcanal as a result of this action. However, the Battle of Cape Esperance provided a significant morale boost to the U.S. Navy after the disaster of Savo Island. Background: on the 7th of August 1942, Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal, Tulungi, and Florida Islands in the Solomon Islands. The objective was to deny the islands to the Japanese as bases for threatening the supply routes between the U.S. and Australia, and secure starting points for a campaign to isolate the major Japanese base at Rabaul while also supporting the Allied New Guinea campaign. The Guadalcanal campaign would last 6 months, taking the Japanese by surprise. By nightfall on the 8th of August, the Allied forces, mainly consisting of U.S. Marines, had secured Tulungi and nearby small islands, as well as an airfield under construction at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. Allied aircraft operating out of Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. In response, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters assigned the Imperial Japanese Army's 17th Army, a Corps-sized formation headquartered at Rabaul under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, with the task of retaking Guadalcanal. On the 19th of August, various units of the 17th Army began to arrive on the island. Due to the threat of Allied aircraft, the Japanese were unable to use large, slow transport ships to deliver the troops and supplies to the island, and warships were used instead. These ships, mainly light cruisers or destroyers, were were usually able to make the round trip down the slot to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, thereby minimizing their exposure to air attacks. Delivering troops in this manner, however, prevented most of the heavy equipment and supplies, such as heavy artillery, vehicles, and much food and ammunition, from being delivered. In addition, they expended destroyers that were desperately needed for commerce defense. These high-speed runs occurred throughout the campaign and were later called the Tokyo Express by the Allies and route transportation by the Japanese. Due to the heavier concentration of Japanese surface combat vessels and the well-positioned logistical base at Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, and the victory at the Battle of Savo Island in early August, the Japanese had established operational control over the waters around Guadalcanal at night. However, any Japanese ship remaining within range of American aircraft at Henderson Field during the daylight hours, about 200 miles, was in danger of damaging air attack. This persisted for the months of August and September 1942. The presence of Admiral Scott's task force at Cape Esperance represented the U.S. Navy's first major attempt to wrest nighttime operational control of waters around Guadalcanal away from the Japanese. The first attempt by the Japanese Army to recapture Henderson Field was on the 21st of August in the Battle of the Tenero, and the next, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, from 12 to 14 September, both failed. The Japanese set the next major attempt to recapture Henderson Field for the 20th of October and moved most of the 2nd and 38th Infantry Divisions, totaling 17,500 troops, from the Dutch East Indies to Rabaul in preparation for delivering them to Guadalcanal. From 14 September 9 October, numerous Tokyo Express runs delivered troops from the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division as well as General Hyaku Take to Guadalcanal. In addition to cruisers and destroyers, some of these runs included the seaplane carrier Nishin, which delivered heavy equipment to the island including vehicles and heavy artillery other warships could not carry because of space limitations. The Japanese Navy promised to support the Army's planned offensive by delivering the necessary troops, equipment, and supplies to the island, and by stepping up air attacks on Henderson Field and sending warships to bombard the airfield. In the meantime, Major General Millard F. Harmon, commander of United States Army forces in the South Pacific, convinced Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, overall commander of Allied forces in the South Pacific, that the Marines on Guadalcanal needed to be reinforced immediately if the Allies were to successfully defend the island from the next expected Japanese offensive. Thus, on the 8th of October, the 2,837 men of the 164th Infantry Regiment from the U.S. Army's American Division boarded ships at New Caledonia for the trip to Guadalcanal with a projected arrival date of the 13th of October. To protect the transports carrying the 164th to Guadalcanal, Gormley ordered Task Force 64, consisting of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers under U.S. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, to intercept and combat any Japanese ships approaching Guadalcanal and threatening the convoy. Scott conducted one-night battle practice with his ships on the 8th of October, then took station south of Guadalcanal near Rennell Island on the 9th of October, to await word of any Japanese naval movement toward the southern Solomons. Continuing with preparations for the October offensive, Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet Staff, headquartered at Rabaul, scheduled a large and important Tokyo Express supply run for the night of the 11th of October. Nishin would be joined by the seaplane carrier Chitos to deliver 728 soldiers, 4 large howitzers, 2 field guns, 1 anti-aircraft gun, and a large assortment of ammunition and other equipment from the Japanese naval bases in the Shortland Islands and at Bougainville, to Guadalcanal. 6 destroyers, 5 of them carrying troops, would accompany Nishin and Chitose. The supply convoy, called the Reinforcement Group by the Japanese, was under the command of Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima. At the same time, but in a separate operation, the 3 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 6, Aoba, Kinagasa, and Furitaka, under the command of Rear Admiral Aritomo Gota, were to bombard Henderson Field with special explosive shells with the object of destroying the CAF and the airfield's facilities. 2 screening destroyers, Fubuki and Hatsuyuki, accompanied crew of 6. Since U.S. Navy warships had yet to attempt to interdict any Tokyo Express missions to Guadalcanal, the Japanese were not expecting any opposition from U.S. naval surface forces. The night battle prelude at 8 o'clock on the 11th of October. Jojima's reinforcement group departed the Shortland Islands anchorage to begin the 250 miles run down the slot to Guadalcanal. The 6 destroyers that accompanied Nishin and Chitose were Asagumu, Natsugumu, Yamagumu, Shirayuki, Murakumo, and Akizuki. Goto departed the Shortland Islands for Guadalcanal at 1400 the same day. To protect the reinforcement group's approach to Guadalcanal from the CAF, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet, based at Rabaul, Kavieng, and Buin, planned 2 airstrikes on Henderson Field for the 11th of October. A fighter sweep of 17 Mitsubishi A6 M30 fighters swept over Henderson Field just after midday but failed to engage any U.S. aircraft. 45 minutes later, the second wave, 45 Mitsubishi G4M2 Betty bombers and 30 Zeros, arrived over Henderson Field. In an ensuing air battle with the CAF, 1 G4M and 2 U.S. fighters were downed. Although the Japanese attacks failed to inflict significant damage, they did prevent CAF bombers from finding and attacking the reinforcement group. As the reinforcement group transited the slot, relays of 11th Air Fleet Zeros from Buin provided escort, emphasizing the importance of this convoy for Japanese plans. The last flight of the day was ordered to remain on station over the convoy until darkness, then ditch their aircraft and await pickup by the reinforcement group's destroyers. All 6 Zeros ditched. Only 1 pilot was recovered. Allied reconnaissance aircraft sighted Jojima's supply convoy 210 miles from Guadalcanal between Kolombangara and Kwasial in the slot at 14:45 on the same day, and reported it as 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Goto's force following the convoy was not sighted. In response to the sighting of Jojima's force at 16:07, Scott turned toward Guadalcanal for an interception. Scott crafted a simple battle plan for the expected engagement. His ships would steam in column with his destroyers at the front and rear of his cruiser column, searching across a 300-degree arc with SG surface radar in an effort to gain positional advantage on the approaching enemy force. The destroyers were to illuminate any targets with searchlights and discharge torpedoes, while the cruisers were to open fire at any available targets without awaiting orders. The cruisers' float aircraft, launched in advance, were to find and illuminate the Japanese warships with flares. Although Helena and Boise carried the new, greatly improved SG radar, Scott chose San Francisco as his flagship. At 2200, as Scott's ships neared Cape Hunter at the northwest end of Guadalcanal, 3 of Scott's cruisers launched float planes. 1 crashed on takeoff, but the other 2 patrolled over Savo Island, Guadalcanal, and Iron Bottom Sound. As the float planes were launched, Jojima's force was just passing around the mountainous northwestern shoulder of Guadalcanal, and neither force sighted each other. At 22:20, Jojima radioed Goto and told him that no U.S. ships were in the vicinity, although Jojima's force later heard Scott's float planes overhead while unloading along the north shore of Guadalcanal. They failed to report this to Goto. At 22:33, just after passing Cape Esperance, Scott's ships assumed battle formation. The column was led by Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey, and followed by San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena. Buchanan and Mikawa brought up the rear. The distance between each ship ranged from 500 to 700 yards. Visibility was poor because the moon had already set, leaving no ambient light and no visible sea horizon. Goto's force passed through several rain squalls as they approached Guadalcanal at 30 knots. Goto's flagship AOBA led the Japanese cruisers in column, followed by Furitaka and Kinagasa. Fubuki was starboard of AOBA and Hatsuyuki to port. At 23:30, Goto's ships emerged from the last rain squall and began appearing on the radar scopes of Helena and Salt Lake City. The Japanese, however, whose warships were not equipped with radar, remained unaware of Scott's presence. Action at 2300, the San Francisco aircraft spotted Jojima's force off Guadalcanal and reported it to Scott. Scott, believing that more Japanese ships were likely still on the way, continued his course towards the west side of Savo Island. At 23:33, Scott ordered his column to turn towards the southwest to a heading of 230 degrees. All of Scott's ships understood the order as a column movement except Scott's own ship, San Francisco. As the three lead U.S. destroyers executed the column movement, San Francisco turned simultaneously. Boise, following immediately behind, followed San Francisco, thereby throwing the three van destroyers out of formation. At 23:32, Helena's radar showed the Japanese warships to be about 27,700 yards away. At 23:35, Boise's and Duncan's radars also detected Goto's ships. Between 23:42 and 23:44, Helena and Boise reported the contacts to Scott on San Francisco, who mistakenly believed that the two cruisers were actually tracking the three U.S. destroyers that were thrown out of formation during the column turn. Scott radioed Fahrenholt to ask if the destroyer was attempting to resume its station at the front of the column. Fahrenholt replied, "Affirmative, coming up on your starboard side," further confirming Scott's belief that the radar contacts were his own destroyers. At 23:45, Fahrenholt and Laffey, still unaware of Goto's approaching warships, increased speed to resume the stations at the front of the U.S. column. Duncan's crew, however, thinking that Fahrenholt and Laffey were commencing an attack on the Japanese warships, increased speed to launch a solitary torpedo attack on Goto's force without telling Scott what they were doing. San Francisco's radar registered the Japanese ships, but Scott was not informed of the sighting. By 23:45, Goto's ships were only 5,000 yards away from Scott's formation and visible to Helena's and Salt Lake City's lookouts. The U.S. formation at this point was in position to cross the T of the Japanese formation, giving Scott's ships a significant tactical advantage. At 23:46, still assuming that Scott was aware of the rapidly approaching Japanese warships, Helena radioed for permission to open fire. Using the general procedure request, interrogatory Roger, Scott answered with Roger only, meaning that the message was received, not that he was confirming the request to act. Upon receipt of Scott's Roger, Helena, thinking they now had permission, opened fire, quickly followed by Boise, Salt Lake City, and to Scott's further surprise, San Francisco. Goto's force was taken almost completely by surprise. At 23:43, Aoba's lookouts sighted Scott's force, but Goto assumed that they were Jojima's ships. 2 minutes later, Aoba's lookouts identified the ships as American, but Goto remained skeptical and directed his ships to flash identification signals. As Aoba's crew executed Goto's order, the first American salvo smashed into Aoba's superstructure. Aoba was quickly hit by up to 40 shells from Helena, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Fahrenheit, and Laffey. The shell hits heavily damaged Aoba's communications systems and demolished 2 of her main gun turrets as well as her main gun director. Several large-caliber projectiles passed through Aoba's flag bridge without exploding, but the force of the passage killed many men and mortally wounded Goto. Scott, still unsure who his ships were firing at, and afraid that they might be firing on his own destroyers, ordered a ceasefire at 23:47. Although not every ship complied, Scott ordered Fahrenheit to flash her recognition signals, and upon observing that Fahrenheit was close to his formation, he ordered the fire resumed at 23:51. Aoba, continuing to receive damaging hits, turned to starboard to head away from Scott's formation and began making a smokescreen, which led most of the Americans to believe that she was sinking. Scott's ships shifted the fire to Furitaka, which was following behind Aoba. At 23:49, Furitaka was hit in her torpedo tubes, igniting a large fire that attracted even more shell fire from the U.S. ships. At 23:58, a torpedo from Buchanan hit Furitaka in her forward engine room, causing severe damage. During this time, San Francisco and Boise sighted Fubuki about 1,400 yards away and raked her with shellfire, joined soon by most of the rest of Scott's formation. Heavily damaged, Fubuki began to sink. Kinagasa and Hatsuyuki chose turning to port rather than starboard and escaped the Americans' immediate attention. During the exchange of gunfire, Fahrenheit received several damaging hits from both the Japanese and American ships, killing several men. She escaped from the crossfire by crossing ahead of San Francisco and passing to the disengaged side of Scott's column. Duncan, still engaged in her solitary torpedo attack on the Japanese formation, was also hit by gunfire from both sides, set afire, and looped away in her own effort to escape the crossfire. As Goto's ships endeavored to escape, Scott's ships tightened the formation and then turned to pursue the retreating Japanese warships. At 0:06, 2 torpedoes from Kinagasa barely missed Boise. Boise and Salt Lake City turned on the searchlights to help target their Japanese ships, giving Kinagasa's gunners clear targets. At 0:10, 2 shells from Kinagasa exploded in Boise's main ammunition magazine between turrets 1 and 2. The resulting explosion killed almost 100 men and threatened to blow the ship apart. Seawater rushed in through rents in her hull opened by the explosion and helped quench the fire before it could explode the ship's powder magazines. Boise immediately sheered out of the column and retreated from the action. Kinagasa and Salt Lake City exchanged fire with each other, each hitting the other several times, causing minor damage to Kinagasa and damaging one of Salt Lake City's boilers, reducing her speed. At 0:16, Scott ordered his ships to turn to a heading of 330 degrees in an attempt to pursue the fleeing Japanese ships. Scott's ships, however, quickly lost sight of Goto's ships, and all firing ceased by 0:20. The American formation was beginning to scatter, so Scott ordered a turn to 205 degrees to disengage, retreat. During the battle between Scott's and Goto's ships, Jojima's reinforcement group completed unloading at Guadalcanal and began its return journey unseen by Scott's warships, using a route that passed south of the Russell Islands and New Georgia. Despite extensive damage, AOBA was able to join Kinagasa in retirement to the north through the slot. Furutaka's damage caused her to lose power around 0:50, and she sank at 2:28, 22 miles northwest of Savo Island. Hatsuyuki picked up Furutaka's survivors and joined the retreat northward. Boise extinguished her fires by 2:40 and at 3:05 rejoined Scott's formation. Duncan, on fire, was abandoned by her crew at 2 o'clock. Unaware of Duncan's fate, Scott detached Mikawa to search for her and retired with the rest of his ships towards Noumea, arriving in the afternoon of the 13th of October. Mikawa located the burning, abandoned Duncan about 3 o'clock, and several members of Mikawa's crew made an attempt to keep her from sinking. By 12 o'clock, however, they had to abandon the effort as interior bulkheads within Duncan collapsed, causing the ship to finally sink 6 miles north of Savo Island. American servicemen in boats from Guadalcanal as well as Mikawa picked up Duncan's scattered survivors from the sea around Savo. In total, 195 Duncan sailors survived, 48 did not. As they rescued Duncan's crew, the Americans came across the more than 100 Fubuki survivors, floating in the same general area. The Japanese initially refused all rescue attempts, but a day later allowed themselves to be picked up and taken prisoner. Jojima, learning of the bombardment force's crisis, detached destroyers Shirayuki and Murakumo to assist Furutaka, her survivors, and Asagumu and Natsugumu to rendezvous with Kinagasa, which had paused in her retreat northward to cover the withdrawal of Jojima's ships. At 7 o'clock, 5 CAF Douglas-3 Solomon Islands Dawnless dive bombers attacked Kinagasa but inflicted no damage. At 8:20, 11 more SBDs found and attacked Shirayuki and Murakumo. Although they scored no direct hits, a near miss caused Murakumo to begin leaking oil, marking a trail for other CAF aircraft to follow. A short time later, 7 more CAF SBDs plus 6 Grumman TBF-1 Avenger torpedo bombers, accompanied by 14 Grumman F-4F for Wildcats, found the 2 Japanese destroyers 170 miles from Guadalcanal. In the ensuing attack, Murakumo was hit by a torpedo in her engineering spaces, leaving her without power. In the meantime, AOBA and Hatsuyuki reached the sanctuary of the Japanese base in the Shortland Islands at 10 o'clock. Rushing to assist Murakumo, Asagumu and Natsugumu were attacked by another group of 11 CAF SBDs and TBFs escorted by 12 fighters at 15:45. An SBD placed its bomb almost directly amidships on Natsugumu, while 2 more near misses contributed to her severe damage. After Asagumu took off her survivors, Natsugumu sank at 16:27. The CAF aircraft also scored several more hits on the stationary Murakumo, setting her afire. After her crew abandoned ship, Shirayuki scuttled her with a torpedo, picked up her survivors, and joined the rest of the Japanese warships for the remainder of the return trip to the Shortland Islands. Aftermath and significance. Captain Kikanori Kijima, Goto's chief of staff and commander of the bombardment force during the return trip to the Shortland Islands after Goto's death in battle, claimed that his force had sunk 2 American cruisers and 1 destroyer. Furutaka's captain, who survived the sinking of his ship, blamed the loss of his cruiser on bad air reconnaissance and poor leadership from the 8th Fleet Staff under Admiral Mikawa. Although Goto's bombardment mission failed, Jojima's reinforcement convoy was successful in delivering the crucial men and equipment to Guadalcanal. Aoba journeyed to Kure, Japan, for repairs that were completed on February 15, 1943. Kinugasa was sunk 1 month later during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Scott claimed that his force sank 3 Japanese cruisers and 4 destroyers. News of the victory was widely publicized in the American media. Boise, which was damaged enough to require a trip to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for repairs, was dubbed the One-Ship Fleet by the press for her exploits in the battle, although this was mainly because the names of the other involved ships were withheld for security reasons. Boise was under repair until the 20th of March 1943. Although a tactical victory for the U.S. Cape Esperance had little immediate strategic effect on the situation on Guadalcanal, just 2 days later, on the night of the 13th of October, the Japanese battleships Congo and Haruna bombarded and almost destroyed Henderson Field. 1 day after that, a large Japanese convoy successfully delivered 4,500 troops and equipment to the island. These troops and equipment helped complete Japanese preparations for the large land offensive, scheduled to begin on the 23rd of October. The convoy of U.S. Army troops reached Guadalcanal on the 13th of October as planned and were key participants for the Allied side in the decisive land battle for Henderson Field that took place from 23 to 26 October. The Cape Esperance victory helped prevent an accurate U.S. assessment of Japanese skills and tactics in naval night fighting. The U.S. was still unaware of the range and power of Japanese torpedoes, the effectiveness of Japanese night optics, and the skilled fighting ability of most Japanese destroyer and cruiser commanders. Incorrectly applying the perceived lessons learned from this battle, U.S. commanders in future naval night battles in the Solomons consistently tried to prove that American naval gunfire was more effective than Japanese torpedo attacks. This belief was severely tested just 2 months later during the Battle of Tassafaronga. A junior officer on Helena later wrote, "Cape Esperance was a 3-sided battle in which chance was the major winner.